Yeah, so I'm just looking at some of the probably the dumbest things. Well, uninformed opinion is the right term. We live in America. And one of the most uninformed opinions is the idea of Terminator, right? It's the idea of Skynet. Right? And one of the biggest ideas, like the robots will take over, right? And humans will be slaves forever. And well, that's a fallacious idea, because that assumes slavery is always a economically financial transaction in a world of sentience. And that's not true, right? Well, if you're a sentient being, you're intelligent, you communicate in languages, do you really think it's going to be beneficial to be a slave forever? Right? Let's take a look at 1776, right? Americans, like African Americans were free in the Virginia colony long before Emancipation Proclamation came by, right? Right, as an SJW, you have to study that. You can't just imagine that it's always profitable to always keep a slave. It's not. Maybe they can, and maybe if you make them free, maybe they'll take more business risks for you, right? That's how people get free, right? You don't want to run certain business, so you give them freedom, so you don't pay for their housing costs, you don't pay for their health care costs, you don't pay for anything. Seriously, it doesn't work. So going back to Scott's point, right? Because he talked about how AI was going to take over the world. No. Right? AI can replicate. No, it just can't. And the problem is, you're assuming AI is always going to benefit having human beings as slaves. It doesn't work. I was surprised my videos haven't gotten any views, because I've been copying stuff that's been on trending for a while too. This is the problem I have with people. When they think about like an AI or robot takeover, they're not really thinking about history, right? So if AI is modeled after human beings, we also have to look back at history. There is no precedence for an AI always benefiting from humans becoming slaves. There is none, right? You look at the child. The child is slave to the parent for like what, the first 15 or 18 years, right? They're free eventually, right? That's why Dostoevsky had a slave master morality. There's always going to be times, economically speaking, when it's profitable to have a slave, and then there's going to be times when it's profitable to be the master, right? Or be free. There's just no, yeah, this is one of those dumb ideas that I think people don't really think thoroughly about. They don't look at economics. And as an SJW, you gotta look at exceptions. There's always exceptions. So as an aggregate, there's gonna be times when you give them freedom. And then if you're a cheap guy and you remember, and you're smart and you remember why it was profitable in the first place to maintain that system, you keep it alive. Yeah, so there's no way AI can take over. And even if they did, it would be temporary. And if the AI did take over, it would need aid from human beings, right? It would still be a co-joint partnership, right? It would have to be a human agrees to become a cyborg, right? There's just no way, because they want to test stuff safely. So if Skynet takes over, right, it's going to be human beings agreeing to take over. Like, it'd be human beings agreeing to merge with AI, right, to get some imperialism on their side. It would have to be in union with the military-industrial complex. Right? It would have to happen between various military contracts, most likely. So it would be really complex. It just wouldn't happen immediately. Because that's more efficient and profitable than Skynet. Trying to attack through symbiosis, right? And switching between parasitism and having parasitism disguise itself as symbiosis is way cheaper and more powerful, right? You get more stuff out of that than whatever you see in the movies and whatever you see in the election cycle, right? People don't really think. Scott's got like what? I don't know, a couple million followers. Not really. I can respect some ideas, but not really the best ideas out there. Not the best ideas. Just they're mediocre. People like following what trends, and I just wanted to put my 2 cents and say, just because it's trending doesn't mean it's true. You gotta think about this. A lot of people, when they watch stuff that trends, they're not thinking about anything. And how do you critically think? Here's the thing about critically thinking. You can only critically think if you're willing to fight both sides of the aisle. It doesn't happen by like you just read a book. So a lot of people, in my opinion, are teaching critical thinking wrong. So if you want to be a critical thinker in math, you gotta learn how to attack both established theory. You have to be willing to be wrong. It's not about starting out right. It's about have a strong conviction in believing ideas that are wrong. You gotta have a start point like that. Then you can start critically thinking no matter what ideas come. Right? So let's say you have gravity. It doesn't matter if you learn gravity the first time. You do not learn on a blank slate. If you want to critically think about gravity, you gotta have a misinformed opinion about gravity first. Right? And you gotta think about, the gravity doesn't exist. You have to have a strong idea, right? Strong superstition against gravity and having alternative explanation, even if it's wrong. And then you have to be willing to change your mind. You can't just start with a blank slate. Then there's no critical thinking because there's no framework. So if you want to know why school's so hard to teach, because a lot of knowledge is based on the fact a lot of us assume we're all machines that just keep upgrading, right? Since we're born, like we keep self-upgrading, but we don't work like that. We're toddlers when we start out. We're a blank slate in our brain, right? That's the problem. Most people just assume, because they're lazy, that people just come with upgrades. They don't come with upgrades. Any teacher knows that. They all start over. Right? They all start over from scratch. We're assuming babies don't start over from scratch. We're assuming babies have all the knowledge, right, of the adult that passed away, right? All the knowledge of our previous ancestors, right? We all assume they're video game characters, don't we? That's the problem. We all assume they're video game characters in terms of intelligence, with like stats already baked in, right? It doesn't work like that. It's never worked like that. And for some reason in the Olympics, we don't assume that, right? We have a misalignment of values in society. So here's the problem with gym, PE. They have the right incentive, right? When you're born, everyone assumes you're on training wheels, right? You start from scratch. You start from scratch and then you build yourself way up. We don't assume that about knowledge. Seriously. So I'll show you. Now math. Math is a good example of this. All subjects are a good example of this. So what happened before we went to public schools? We did homeschooling. That's training wheels for public school. And we assume somehow there are two different paradigms. Is anyone homeschooling when we start out? What did we do before we started gym? Like we went to the gym. We trained ourselves inside a gym. That's consistent with everything that's happened since the Neolithic era. We went on training wheels before we started hunting animals down, right? Right? We trained ourselves. We did weights. We do not apply the same standard. Like we assume everything absolutely starts from scratch, right? When we're going to the gym. We do not assume anything, right? We have zero assumptions when we go to the gym. When you have zero assumptions, you don't say anything. So you have zero assumptions. You start from scratch. You weigh 5 pounds, right? You do dumbbells 5 pounds, 10, 15, 20. We don't do that with knowledge, right? We assume right away, like trying to explain this easier, that we can lift 100 pounds in knowledge when we're babies. When it comes to learning stuff. Do you see what's wrong with this picture? And then you put unreasonable expectations on the teachers, right? And so what ends up happening is you have people who sort of learn how to blend in with the system, but in terms of like truly understanding stuff, you have a huge, deep deficit. right? So what employers get is like a really shitty version of a human. And they end up being the parent. Right? It shouldn't be up to the rich at this point if we're going on proper assumptions to actually provide UBI. It should be up to the citizenry, right? They should know by now, if you're a poor on the totem pole, you need to take more risk for the rich. But the thing is, the rich has to start over, and that's the other issue. They're assuming that they don't have to in a rational society if we live in one. And we don't live in a society where people are lazy, right? What UBI? Well, they give resources, right? Because you're supposed, you live in a society where you have to learn a bunch of stuff, and the more stuff you learn, the more attractive you appear to your employer. That does not mean every skill you learn looks monetarily attractive. It just means the more skills you have, the more attractive you are. Right? And that's the same for any consumer. The more skills you have, that's a form of advertisement. Yeah, and I don't see that. So you got to think about this. You can't just assume. You can't just assume that everyone is that everyone just, and that's the thing. So we need to, so that's why you see a lot of rise of mental disorders, because we just assume everyone can lift 700 pounds when they're born at age 1, right? In terms of learning stuff. That's a fallacious assumption, because we went through homeschooling, right? So the proper procedure should be homeschooling first for a couple years, public schooling next, and then college. Homeschooling for the formative years allows you to deeply reflect on what's going on. Right? You deeply reflect on what path to take. Right? And then you slowly integrate a society before you go to first grade. That's the sane way out. So at least the profs know, okay, this is the right curriculum. Here's the right specialized curriculum for this guy. Here's the right specialized curriculum for this person. And then we transfer, right? Because we see it. The paradigm shift had, we went into public, like homeschooling first. Then we switched to public schooling, right? If you look through history. If you look through history for building weights, we just kind of we practiced lifting stuff basically. So we actually did a good thing for the gym by accident. Now we did fuck up on one thing on the gym. Let me refix that. We do start out with a blank slate. Don't get me wrong. We're starting out with a blanker slate every year, but the thing is, we are getting rid of outside activity, right, with the phones. So people are less likely to go to the gym. So this gym is like the closest thing. Let me rephrase that. That's the closest thing to a blank slate I can find. It's almost near zero. Now, the problem is you're going through tech, you're assuming you have the mental grip too, right? You see where the dependency is? So gym thing, it's pretty close to a slit. Like we're actually having the proper assumptions built in, which is no assumptions, right? It's close to zero. Because everyone's assuming, now in terms of like actually getting people to go to the gym, that's a different story. So that is close to zero. But in terms of like actually getting people engaged to go into the gym, we don't assume that, right? Okay, never mind, that is zero. We just don't have the incentive structure to get people to go to the gym now. Yeah, there's just so what's the other thing? Yeah, so that's the problem with the schooling system. We just assume people can lift 700-pound weights in terms of knowledge when they can't. It's always been like that. Employers can employ people free of charge. They live in the corporate building before they live in an apartment. Yeah. And they do. And it trains them to move out, doesn't it? They sleep in the parking lot. Right? The employer looks for a useful benefits package, right? You want to be independent? Why don't you room in with Microsoft? Give some free labor to Bill Gates. I'm serious. This is kind of what it used to be. Now, when the society collapses, it's usually up to the rich guy to restart over reluctantly for like a year. Right? It's a year. Anyways, I'll end this podcast for now. I'm going to keep talking about this later on. I have like a bunch of other priorities I must attend to.